So Marx begins by telling us that in his view, India is a lot like Italy. Geographically speaking, he says, you look at the Alps and you look at the Himalayas, except it's on an Asiatic scale, by which he means, of course, that it's massive, it's huge, it's absolutely enormous. Italy is really tiny in comparison. And just like Italy, he says, Hindustan, when it was not under foreign invaders, dissolved into small statelets and small states, even going down to the very village level. So because if you look at the history of Italy, when it was not united, there were several periods in Italian history where it was fragmented, badly fragmented. He says India is much the same. But in social terms, he says it's actually a lot more like Ireland, in the sense that Ireland is a place where, of course, enormous famines have occurred just before Marx is writing this essay. And it's a place where the British have gone and colonized and really, really been very brutal with the Irish. And so for that reason, he says that India is just like Ireland, a world of sorrows, a world of woes. This voluptuousness on the one hand, by which, of course, he's referring to the incredibly beautiful landscape of Italy as well as India, and of a world of woes, which is the world of Ireland reflected in India, is anticipated in the ancient traditions of the religion of Hindustan. In other words, Hinduism reflects these two polar opposites, the world of plenty and the world of nothingness and pain and misery, etc. It's reflected in the religion. How? That religion is at once a religion of sensualist exuberance and a religion of self-torturing asceticism. You see both sides in the ancient Hindu religion, exuberance and self-asceticism. A religion of the lingam and of the juggernaut, the religion of the monk and of the Bayadri. You see both aspects. He says, I don't agree with those who think that India was some sort of an idyllic paradise before the British arrived there. Its history, Indian history, is already marked by fragmentation, by invasions, by struggles, and so on. At the same time, he very sarcastically refers to Sir Charles Wood, who was the Secretary of State of India, and says that I don't need, unlike Mr. Charles Wood, to refer to, Huli Khan to argue that India was really terrible before the British came here either. So I'm rejecting both these extreme views, the view that India was absolutely perfect before the British arrived, and the view that the British are just the best thing that's ever happened to India. Both are stupid views. In fact, he says the British have been worse than all the previous conquerors that have ever come to India. European despotism, he says, has been planted on top of Asiatic despotism by the British East India Company, and this, he says, has created a monstrosity that is far more ugly than anything you can find in the temple of Salset, which is a temple that is found in the north of Mumbai, which has all these statues in it of various Hindu deities, etc., some of which are not very good pleasant to look at. For example, Kali as well. All the civil wars, invasions, revolutions, conquests, famines, strangely complex, rapid and destructive as the successive action in Hindustan may appear, did not go deeper than its surface. Everything that's happened in Indian history just happened at the surface level. So he says all the wars that have occurred have only touched the surface of India. They did not change as such the social fabric, the social system of India. England, however, has broken down the entire framework of Indian society without any symptom of reconstitution yet appearing. They have broken down the social fabric of India, and it doesn't look like it's being reconstituted at any level. This loss of his old world, with no gain of a new one, imparts a particular kind of melancholy to the present misery of the Hindu, and separates Hindustan ruled by Britain from all its ancient traditions and from the whole of its past history. In other words, the kind of pain and suffering that Hindustanis are facing right now is of a wholly different kind than anything they've ever faced before. It's making them extremely depressed in a way that they've never felt before. By the way, when he uses the term Hindu, he doesn't mean by that only those people who are of the religion Hindu. He means Hindustani. He means everybody that lives in India, basically. India itself, of course, is just a word that is derived from Hindu. Hindu itself is a word derived from the Sindhu River, Sindhi River, and that is, from there you get the word Indus, India, Sindh, Sindhi, Hindustani, Hindi, all of these basically are from the same root. And the term Hindu was never actually used by people who lived in India. It was a term used by the Persians who lived across on the other side, of course, in what is today Iran. And they referred to the people who lived across the Indus River, the Sindhu River, as the Hindus. And for that reason, the name stuck. We have also referred to ourselves many a times as Hindustani. As you know, in Iqbal's poetry, we often refer to ourselves as, he says, Sare jahan se acha Hindustan hamara. Hum bulbule iske ye gulistan hamara. Now, climate is a key element here in the context of India. He says in Asia, there have always been three different departments. The Department of Finance, which he calls the plunder of the interior, apne logon se hi loot maar karni. War, which is the plunder of the exterior. And finally, the Department of Public Works. Whereas plunder of the interior and exterior is common to pretty much all states. But something is quite unique in the context of Asia, which is Department of Public Works. Why? Because if you look at this map, you see that there is a huge, long sort of area of the world where you have many, many different deserts. They continue across this particular plain, all the way from the Sahara to Mongolia. Climate and territorial conditions, especially the vast tract of desert extending from the Sahara through Arabia, Persia, India and Tartary to the most elevated Asiatic highlands, constituted artificial irrigation by canals and waterworks the basis of Oriental agriculture. In this entire region of the world, he is saying, you have to have artificial irrigation in order for agriculture to exist. This is what separates this region of the world from regions of the world where you have plenty of rain, etc. The agriculture in the regions of the world where there is plenty of rain is obviously going to be built on a different foundation. And since the agriculture is on a different foundation, the kinds of state that arise as a consequence are also going to be very different in these regions of the world. As in Egypt and India, inundations, that is flooding, are used for fertilizing the soil in Mesopotamia, Persia, etc. Advantage is taken of a high level for feeding irrigative canals. This prime necessity of an economical and common use of water necessitated in the Orient the interference of the centralizing power of government. In other words, the way in which agriculture is done in these parts of the world is that when the river floods, you create from the river various canals and you channel that flood water into the plains and use that flood water via canal irrigation to water the fields. This has been the ancient method through which agriculture has been possible in this drier region of the world. But to create those canals, to make sure that that inundated water gets all the way across, what do you need? You need some sort of a situation where all the people down and up the canal are going to be able to work together to dig that canal all the way across, right? It's not just up to you. If you live here and somebody else lives there, everybody has to coordinate in order to get that canal all the way from the river till the field. And who does that? How is that accomplished? That is accomplished by a governing structure, by the state. The state has to come together, or a state has to come together to make sure it does that. So from time immemorial, one of the tasks of the Asiatic state, or the state in this part of the world, has been to ensure that the inundated flood water, etc., artificial irrigation is constructed in such a way such that agriculture is possible. Unlike those parts of the world where you have rainwater coming directly to your different fields, you don't need this kind of canal irrigation, artificial irrigation. So you don't need the state to be in charge of doing these kinds of things. In this part of the world, you need a state to do these sorts of things. How interesting. Hence, an economical function devolved upon all Asiatic governments. All governments in this region, this dry region of the world, had to do one very important task, one very important economic task. They could not be laissez-faire governments. They had to be interventionist governments at a certain level, and that was providing public works to make sure water gets to the field. This artificial fertilization of the soil, dependent on a central government and immediately decaying with the neglect of irrigation and drainage, explains the otherwise strange fact that we now find whole territories barren and desert that were once brilliantly cultivated. In other words, if the government falls and the canals are not taken care of, the artificial irrigation is not taken care of, if there's an invasion and the governing structure is destroyed, what happens? It's not just that the government gets destroyed, it's that agriculture also gets destroyed. And as agriculture gets destroyed, whole civilizations suddenly dry up and vanish. Only their remains can be seen. For example, he says, Palmyra, Petra, ruins of Yemen, large provinces of Egypt, Persia, Hindustan. You can see in these regions of the world, these civilizations developed and then suddenly they just disappeared. Why? Because there was no water anymore. Why? Because something happened to the government, the water could not be supplied. Boom, those civilizations just completely vanished. Could this also be an explanation behind the vanishing of the Indus Valley civilization? Maybe, we don't know. It also explains how a single war of devastation, just one war, has been able to depopulate a country for centuries and to strip it of all its civilization. So maybe in the context of the Indus Valley civilization, there was a war, government fell, it was destroyed, etc. Irrigation got destroyed because there was no government to take care of the irrigation, and as a consequence, the whole civilization just kind of was destroyed, because civilization was so highly dependent on that central government ensuring that the water gets there for agriculture, that if that is destroyed, agriculture is destroyed. If agriculture is destroyed, whole civilizations just vanish and evaporate. Here you see Syria, the remains of a great civilization. Nobody knows what happened to it. Here you see Petra, Jordan. Look at this gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous civilization. If I had one chance to go wherever I could go and I could get the visa, I would really want to go to Petra in Jordan. Look at this incredible, incredible architecture and civilization. Nobody lives here anymore. Nobody knows where these people went. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but you get the general picture that it just, the whole civilization vanished. By the way in which Petra, Jordan would make sure that it gets the water in the middle of this desert itself is absolutely an architectural marvel itself. And here are some remains from Yemen, once a thriving civilization, suddenly just dries up. The desert encroaches again and takes over that civilization if the government fails to provide water, and so on. So the British wanted to carry on agriculture, sadly, in India in their typical laissez-faire manner. Not laissez-faire, although they were pretty lazy as well, but laissez-faire means free market. They're like, well, it's not part of the government, we've never done this before, so we're not going to do this, etc. And as a consequence of that, he says, they have neglected the public works of India, and agriculture has deteriorated in India. In fact, this wasn't true in Marx's time, but in the time that he wrote this article. But it is true, of course, you know, that Britain caused enormous famines, such as the Great Bengal famine, etc., that caused millions of deaths. In fact, some estimate that the number of deaths may have been up to 10 million because of the neglect of agriculture, because of the neglect of public works, and so on. However changing the political aspects of India's past must appear, I mean, you can look at all the dynasties that came and went, all the wars, you know, the Mughals came, the Afghans came, the Persians came, the Arabs came, etc. The Turks came, so many different civilizations have come, the Aryans came, etc. All of these. But here's the interesting thing, all these conquerors came and went, etc. All these dynasties rose and fell, he says. But the interesting thing about India is that its social condition has remained unaltered since its remotest antiquity. In other words, its economy and its structure of society nonetheless would not change. The politics would change, but the economy was pretty steady. The mode of production would not change, he says, until the first decennium of the 19th century, until the bloody British arrived, and then the whole ancient way of life of Indian civilization was destroyed. The hand loom and the spinning wheel, producing their regular myriads of spinners and weavers, were the pivots of the structure of that society. Right? These were the pivots of the manufacture in that society. British steam and science uprooted over the whole surface of Hindustan the union between agriculture and manufacturing industry. What does this phrase mean, the union between agriculture and industry? You can see that this person doing manufacture is doing it in the village, in the home. And whatever she's producing in the way of cloth, etc., is going to be also used in the village. So in that sense then, the villages were self-sufficient. They would produce whatever they required, and that was it. They lived in their village. That is called the union of agriculture and manufacturing. It's not the case in India that the manufacturing is going to occur in the city and the agriculture is going to occur in the countryside, and then the two will trade. He says that's not what's going on in India. That happens in other parts of Europe and so on. But in India, everything the village required was produced inside the village by workers like this. By the way, this is the reason why the handloom, etc., were also taken up as a symbol of the Indian independence struggle. Not only did Gandhi, of course, start to use it, but then it also becomes the spinning wheel, the charkha, as we say, or so much of our poetry is also dedicated to the charkhas, like we say, ghum ve charkhya ghum, right? So in so much Sufi poetry, which means the world revolves, everything changes, and so on. This whole setup that he's describing it precisely because he feels that the mode of production in India before the British came there was very different from the mode of production that exists in Europe. So England, he says, began with driving the Indian cottons from the European market. It then introduced twist into Hindustan, and in the end inundated the very mother country of cotton with cottons. It destroyed the indigenous cotton industry of India. We won't call it an industry. It destroyed the indigenous hand-made manufacturing of cotton in India, and made the cotton, of course, in Manchester and other places, and inundated, just flooded India with cotton. So this is the mode of production, as Marx describes it, of India. He calls it the village system. He says, two features stand out of this village system. The first is there is a central government in charge of the public works. Their prime, of course, work is to ensure that water gets to agriculture. This is very important for this region of the world where you have to have artificial irrigation in order for agriculture. That's one very important aspect of the mode of production of India as being very different from the mode of production, those primitive modes of production like feudalism in the context of Europe. Secondly, a dispersed population with a few small centers based on the domestic union of agricultural and manufacturing pursuits. So you have a dispersed population, they're not necessarily communicating and exchanging with each other. They are producing, whatever they're producing, they're consuming themselves. They are self-sufficient villages. That's what he means by domestic union of agricultural and manufacturing pursuits. Domestic means here, of course, that it's being produced there, it's being produced locally, it's being produced within the home, it's being produced within the village, and it's being consumed within the village, and so on. So they're not really trading with anybody else outside of the village. They're living in the village, and it's a village is self-sufficient, and that's it. They don't really necessarily even see who lives 5 villages down or 3 villages down. That doesn't happen. Those family communities were based on domestic industry, like hand weaving, hand spinning, and hand tilling agriculture. Okay? So everything is being done by hand in India, and in these little village communities that are separated from the towns as such. This is the mode of production of India, very different from European feudalism. This village system now, he says, has been destroyed as much by the British tax collector and the British soldier as by English steam and English free trade. Since free trade has come about, they have completely destroyed this village system. This village system had existed for centuries, he says. And despite the fact that the Mughals would come and the slave dynasties would come and this dynasty and that dynasty would come and go, the village system would just be there throughout and would not change. And now it's destroyed. By blowing up their economical basis, the British have produced the greatest, and to speak the truth, the only social revolution ever heard of in Asia. They've destroyed that mode of production. They've destroyed that economic system. This is the first time that that system has been destroyed. Otherwise, it's existed for centuries, and now it's completely wiped out, he says. It is sickening, he says, but this old world had to die. It had to die. Now, sickening as it must be to human feeling to witness this myriad of industrious, patriarchal, and inoffensive social organizations disorganized and dissolved into their units. They are not offensive. inoffensive organizations. They're destroyed, they're disorganized, they're dissolved, thrown into a sea of woes, into a sea of pain and grief, and their individual members losing at the same time their ancient form of civilization. They lose all their culture even as a consequence, and their hereditary means of subsistence. We must not forget that these idyllic village communities, inoffensive though they may appear, had always been the solid foundation of Oriental despotism. What does he mean? That they restrained the human mind within the smallest possible compass. They restrained the human mind only insofar as the affairs of the village were concerned. People didn't even know what was going on in the rest of the world, making it the unresisting tool of superstition, enslaving it beneath traditional rules, depriving it of all grandeur and historical energies. This system was not a good system. It restricted the mind of the Indians, the villagers, just to their villages, to a small custom, to tradition. It broke their spirit and made them the slave of their own traditions. There was no dynamism in this civilization as such because of this mode of production. We must not forget the barbarian egotism, which, concentrating on some miserable patch of land, had quietly witnessed the ruin of empires, the perpetuation of unspeakable cruelties, the massacre of the population of large towns, with no other consideration bestowed upon them than on natural events. You know, the peasantry seems completely apathetic to Marx, that empires came and went, titanic struggles were waged, and yet the Indian peasant was just laboring away on this little piece of land, didn't know what was going on in the rest of the world, didn't even care. If the dynasty fell, it was like, you know, it's like a natural disaster. It's not a human-made thing. That's the way they treated it. This was itself the hapless prey of any aggressor. These peasants were unfortunately also the prey of any aggressor who deigned to notice it at all. We must not forget that it was an undignified life, stagnatory and vegetated life, that this passive sort of existence evoked on the other part, in contradistinction, wild, aimless, unbounded forces of destruction, and rendered murder itself a religious rite in Hindustan. This mode of life was not good. It had to go. It had to change. So although it pains us to see this ancient mode of life being destroyed, but it was a mode of life which should be destroyed because it was not dynamic, it was not growing. We must not forget that these little communities were contaminated by distinctions of caste and by slavery. Okay, we can say they're inoffensive, but these are no communes. These are villages based on the caste system. These are villages based on slavery of other people, on untouchability of a whole section of society that was the working population. That they subjugated man to external circumstances instead of elevating man, the sovereign of circumstances. That they transformed a self-developing social state into never-changing natural destiny, and thus brought about a brutalizing worship of nature, exhibiting its degradation in the fact that man, the sovereign of nature, fell down on his knees in adoration of Hanuman the monkey and Sabala the cow. It created the worship of nature to such an extent that in fact man did never recognize that he is the sovereign, or we are the sovereign of nature. Rather, we thought that we were subdued by nature. This was how Marx describes and criticizes, in fact, Hinduism as a whole. He says the British are vile. He says England was actuated only by the vilest interests. Vile means something that is evil, and was stupid in her manner of enforcing them. Not only is Britain evil, it is evil and Sone pe Sohaga also stupid. But despite this fact, it has caused a social revolution in Hindustan. What does he mean by a social revolution? Why not political revolution? Because what he means is that the mode of production is changing. The way in which this village community and life is organized is all changing. Mankind, he says, insaniyat puri, dunya mein, mankind cannot fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia. India needs a social revolution, otherwise humanity as a whole cannot fulfill its destiny. Hence, despite all the crimes of England, she was also the unconscious tool of history in bringing about that revolution. It's not that the British wanted to bring about this revolution, they were just doing evil things and in a stupid way, but those evil things in a stupid way are creating something quite new, which is going to cause a revolution in India. Just watch. And that's why he ends this small essay by quoting Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The poem is, "Should this torture then torment us, since it brings us greater pleasure, were not through the rule of Taimur souls devoured without measure." Here's another article that he wrote, also in 1853, called "The Future Results of British Rule in India." He says, why was it that the British were able to establish themselves in India, conquer India? He says, India is a country not only divided between Mohammedan and Hindus, but between tribe and tribe, between caste and caste. A society whose framework was based on a sort of equilibrium, resulting from a general repulsion and constitutional exclusiveness between all its members. It's a society that was highly divided. And because of that, that division just created this kind of equilibrium between all the forces that were pushing against each other. But it was a weak society, not a united one. Such a country and such a society, were they not the predestined prey of conquest, he asks? A society that is divided upon itself, it was going to be conquered. India was going to be conquered. To give you the biggest example of this is that India is held in English thraldom by an Indian army maintained at the cost of India. In other words, the biggest evidence I can give you of the internal division of India is the fact that the British conquered India with Indian soldiers who were paid for by Indian money, money generated in India. India conquered itself. Because of the conflict within India, the British were very easily able to utilize the contradictions in our society against us and to basically take over India. India could not escape the fate of being conquered, sadly. The whole of her past history is the history of the successive conquests she has undergone. She has undergone many conquests. Indian society, he says, has no history at all, at least no known history. Whatever is written of its history, what we call its history, is but the history of the successive intruders who founded their empires on the passive basis of that unresisting and unchanging society. So there are no changes in the mode of production. Of course, there is history in the sense that various dynasties have been created, various dynasties have fallen, wars have occurred. All of that is, yes, has happened. But that is not what Marx refers to as history in this passage. He's referring to changes in the mode of production, changes in the economy. He says the village system remained the same. The caste system has remained the same for thousands of years. That never changed. That did not change. Therefore, he says it is better that the British conquer India than the Turks or the Persians or the Russians. Why not the Turks or the Persians or the Russians? Because the British are capitalist and the Turks and the Persians and the Russians are not. So what will the British do? England, therefore, he says, has to fulfill a double mission in India. One is destructive and the other regenerating the annihilation of old Asiatic society and laying the material foundation of Western society in Asia. In other words, England is laying this foundation of what kind of Western society? Not feudal Western society. He's not interested in that. He's interested in capitalist society. They're laying the foundation for capitalism in India. One is the destruction of the Asiatic mode of production. The other is the creation of a new society, capitalist society. Arabs, Turks, Tatars, Mughals, invaders became Hinduized because their own civilization was actually inferior to India. So when these people came to India, they settled in India, the Mughals, etc., they adopted Indian culture. They forgot their own culture because Indian civilization was culturally superior, in fact, to their civilization in terms of art and literature and language and architecture, all of these things. law, whatever else, etc., philosophy. So they ended up becoming Indianized, except for the British. They didn't. Because Britain had a superior civilization. They had an attitude of superiority, and he says objectively they did have a superior civilization because they had developed not only capitalism but now the Industrial Revolution and so on. I know it hurts really to read these words, doesn't it? It really hurts my sense of pride. They destroyed Indian civilization by breaking up the native communities, by uprooting the native industry, and by leveling all that was great and elevated in the native society. Everything great in India they destroyed. They uprooted the whole of society. The historic pages of their rule in India report hardly anything beyond that destruction. All they have done is destroy, 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 destroy. They had a double mission, remember. One was destruction, the other was regeneration. Most of what they've done is just destroy. The work of regeneration hardly transpires through a heap of ruins. Nevertheless, it has begun. There's a heap of ruins. In there's a glimmer of hope that I see. What is the glimmer of hope? Firstly, he says the British have created the political unity of India. And this political unity is huge and massive, much larger than has existed before. There's only 3 times that India has been united at this scale. One was in the period of the Guptas, the other was in the high point of Akbar and Aurangzeb, etc. And now under British India, they are united in a really big way. Secondly, they have introduced in India electric telegraph, which is further consolidating the political unity of British India, of India. Electrical telegraph, you can send messages, etc. They have a new Indian British army trained by the British in the new way. The old army that used to fight with swords and on horseback, etc., that's finished now anyway. That kind of army cannot win any wars in the context of modern civilization. They have a new kind of army. Don't we know it? We have a new kind of army. That army is in charge, really. They also have a new kind of free press that has not existed in India before. In fact, the press didn't exist in India before. They have introduced private property in land, the zamindari system and the ryotwari system. And again here he criticizes them and he says, my God, the way the British instituted this was so stupid and vile. But nonetheless, they introduced private property in land and have created capitalist relations. A class of people educated in European science, they've also created people like Mohandas Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Jawaharlal Nehru, Taimur Rahman, and you guys as well. We are all the product of basically that British educational system. And finally, steam trains are connecting it to itself and to the world. They've introduced trains, and he likes trains. He says, India was always held back by lack of transportation and exchange. In fact, he says, there is no country in the world that was held back as much by a lack of internal transportation and exchange as is the case with India. No other country has a situation like India. There, he says, are no roads even between villages at that time. So all of that is now changing. They are internally coming together and also connecting to a global economy. The village isolation produced the absence of roads in India, and the absence of roads perpetuated village isolation. In fact, he says, it's so strange that you find in India that one part of India or a few villages down, etc., you find that there's lots and lots of crops and lots of things growing. And a couple of villages down or province down, etc., you'll find that there'll be famine. And in one part of India, food will be wasted. In another part of India, there'll be starvation, and the food just cannot move because they don't have adequate transportation to move the food to the parts of India which are starving. That was the condition before. Now, what did the British want? Well, they wanted to extract resources. They were not on some civilizing mission, or anything. Their goal was only selfish. But, he says, when you have once introduced machinery into the locomotion of a country which possesses iron and coals, you are unable to withhold it from its fabrication. You cannot maintain a net of railways over an immense country without introducing all those industrial processes necessary to meet the immediate and current wants of railway locomotion and out of which there must grow the application of machinery to those branches of industry not immediately connected with railways. The railway system will therefore become in India truly the forerunner of modern industry. The railway system that the British have once introduced into India is going to result over time in the in an industrial revolution in India. Even if they want to stop it, now they won't be able to stop it. Having introduced the railways, not only do you have to build all the industries that work the railways, but then you have to introduce new industries, etc. You keep developing those industries. From the railway develops a whole network of industries, and you go towards industrialization. And this is a good thing. Industry is needed in India. Modern industry resulting from the railway system will dissolve the hereditary division of labor upon which rests the Indian caste. What is a hereditary division of labor? That is that if my father is a Kumhar, I will be a Kumhar. If my father is a Sonhar, I will be a Sonhar. If my father is a Kammi, I will be a Kammi. If my father is a Chamar, I will be a Chamar. If my father is a Chuda, I will be a Chuda. I will be exactly what my caste is. He says this is terrible. This has destroyed the historical energy of the Indian people. It has to be destroyed. Those decisive impediments to Indian progress and Indian power, all of that will be destroyed, and I want to see it destroyed. That should be destroyed. The English bourgeoisie will neither emancipate nor amend the social condition of the mass of people of India. Let's be clear on this. They are not here to emancipate Indians, nor will they make things better even for them. They'll make them worse, okay? But what they will lay are the material premises for both. They lay the material premises for the emancipation of Indians and for their betterment and for the improvement, mending of their social conditions. This is all one can expect from the capitalists, from the bourgeoisie. Has it ever effected progress without dragging individuals and people through blood and dirt, through misery and degradation? No industrial revolution has ever occurred without that. That's the best thing you can expect from a bourgeoisie, is that they will drag people through dirt and mud and exploitation and poverty and death and destruction. And that's how they introduce machinery and industrialization, etc. He says the Indians will not reap the fruits of the new elements of society scattered among them by the British bourgeoisie till in Great Britain itself the now ruling classes shall have been supplanted by the industrial proletariat. So there are two ways in which the Indians can benefit. If there's a socialist revolution in Britain, then the Indians will be better off, yes. Or till the Hindus themselves shall have grown strong enough to throw off the English yoke altogether. If they throw off the English yoke, then they can use the industry to their benefit. As long as the British remain there, they won't get any faida from it. He says, but don't worry, this will happen. We may safely expect to see, at a more or less remote period, the regeneration of that great and interesting country, whose gentle natives, whose people are so gentle, are, to use the expression of Prince Soltykov, even in the most inferior classes, more subtle and adroit than the Italians. It's a highly subtle, adroit kind of people, and whose submission even is counterbalanced by a certain calm nobility. They are being enslaved, and yet there is a calm nobility in them which is amazing, who, notwithstanding their natural languor, have astonished the British officers by their bravery, whose country has been the source of our languages, our religions, and who represent the type of ancient German in the Jat and the type of ancient Greek in the Brahmin. These are great people, and they will be regenerated. They will overthrow the British, and they will be able to take the things that the British have scattered and use it for themselves. The profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of capitalist civilization lies now exposed, unveiled before our eyes, turning from its home where it assumes respectable forms. In England, it assumes, yes, we're bourgeois, it assumes respectable forms to the colonies where it goes naked. Nangi exploitation, जो हमने colonies में What we have seen in India, we have not seen that even in Britain. Capitalism, if you want to see what it really represents, go to the colonies and see what the capitalists have done in India, see what they've done in China, see what they've done in Africa. Then you see what capitalism really is. The British resorted to, he says, atrocious extortion when simple corruption could not keep pace with their rapacity. Matlab, it was atrocious extortion is basically what it was. And when a great social revolution shall have mastered the results of the capitalist bourgeois epoch, the market of the world and the modern powers of production, and subjected them to the common control of the most advanced peoples, then only will human progress cease to resemble that hideous pagan idol who would not drink the nectar but from the skulls of the slain. He is saying progress in capitalism is like Kali. Kali is the goddess of death. And what does Kali do? As you can see, I found the most scary picture I could of Kali. She drinks from the skull of the slain. She drinks the blood from the skull of the slain. She's not a good figure in that sense, at least not in North India, etc. He says that death and destruction that the Indians themselves depict in the form of Kali is basically capitalism. That's basically what we call, quote unquote, progress. Progress everywhere in history has been accomplished by the death and destruction of the very people of that civilization. The Roman divide at impera was the great rule by which Great Britain for about 150 years contrived to retain the tenure of her Indian empire, he says. Now, he is writing about the 1857 War of Independence. When that comes about, what does Marx say? Do you think he says, no, don't do this. The British are good for you? Absolutely not. He says, the Roman divide at imperia means divide and rule. That is what the British have used for the last 150 years to keep the Indians subjected. The present Indian disturbance, yani the mutiny, yani the War of Independence, is not a military mutiny, he says. No, but a national revolt of which the Sipahis are the acting instruments only. It's a national revolt. The people are involved with it. Everybody's involved with it. They want to be free from the British. We have to support them in this national revolt. He's not anti the revolt. He is actually very much in favor of it. He's anti-British. And there was this huge propaganda inside Britain about how the Sipahis and the Indians had done all these horrible things to the Mem Sahibs and to the Sahibs, etc. Just as you see in today's world all this horrible propaganda about what the Palestinians have done and so on and so forth. Right? You see that all the time. He says, however infamous the conduct of the Sipahis, it is only the reflex in a concentrated form of England's own conduct in India. If they are doing these horrible things to the Sahibs and to the Mem Sahibs, it is because of the things that the Sahibs and the Mem Sahibs have done to the Indian people. To characterize that rule, it suffices to say that torture formed an organic institution of its financial policy. Its whole financial policy, if you want to ask me what was British rule like in India, it's basically, its financial policy was torture the Indians. Bura hal kar do unko, lahu luhan kar do unko. That's why they are fighting back the way they are fighting back. You left them no choice.